Hello and welcome back to the fourth tutorial for the character controller. We should have it a basic framework by the end of this, meaning we'll have the head done, you'll be able to look around and hopefully understand how to improve upon this. Most likely I'll do water after this or swimming. Actually, no, jumping is the next one. Mainly because there's some interesting things to do with there because we don't have gravity yet in this. So with this, we're going to do another, we want to put this in the players thing and I haven't named it yet, so it doesn't matter. With this, we're going to do a head controller. The reason we're going to do a head controller is because, well, controlling the face, or head, yeah, I'm just going to do controller for now. The reason we're doing a head controller is generally moving the head can be interesting sometimes. For that reason, we wanted to keep it very localized. Like if you want to lean around the corner, we're going to have to compile how to lean. Rotation of the player can also be stored here, meaning if you move the mouse left and right, how much the head will rotate will depend on some variables such as sensitivity, or maybe if you're climbing a ladder and you don't want to be able to look around everywhere. Usually the head, I like to keep it separate from the body just because it's almost like it has a brain of its own while this is loading. Alright. So I shall bring over here. Now, the first thing that we want for this is it won't necessarily be a mono behavior, as everything I've created so far generally isn't. Add controller, we can also do a namespace. 74.controllers. Players. So with this head controller, when we create it, we'll want two game objects. The reason for two game objects is so we can have the body rotate and the body will be apparent to the head. This is so that the head can easily follow around the body without lagging behind. And if I didn't already mention, this is geared towards first person. However, you could make a head controller thing or an array of head controllers where you have a first person or a third person. Maybe you have an over-the-shoulder camera or something. In which case, the head controller would have two separate handlings, which is also why you should separate the head from the body. Because, for instance, let's say, well, actually, for the most part, the walking would also derive from the rotation of either the body or the head. Meaning, when you're walking forward, usually the way I like to do it is I like to get the body's rotation. Because unless the body is in third person, there's no real reason that it's going to rotate upwards or downwards. The same goes for swimming, at least. I would then get the movement from the head, because unless I want to be able to swim in either direction but not necessarily go down with a camera control, it would be tedious. Which also means that the head controller would most likely have two different outputs for the rotation, or at least the transform.forward, which everything can then be derived from it. Or you could just return the transforms of the head and body. If that's what the head controller is used for. If you were to make two separate head controllers, well, yes, no. Either way, they're both going to have the eye updatable. You could probably do an abstract thing where you return the certain variables knowing exactly which direction you're going to be going in. For instance, if you're doing third person and you want your character to move instantly, meaning they're always, like, let's say you're looking forward and you press back, you don't like circle around like a car. You would instantly go back. You could probably do the transform dot back or negative forward, because Unity really likes to not give you variables if you can just do a negative to it. The reason we're doing an eye updatable is because I want to do a lean with this, because leaning in Unity is tricky if you don't know how to lean correctly. However, this one is also what took me so long to understand. So when we first create this, we want a private game object. We want the main camera. We also want the main body. Actually, the main body will most likely be on the player controller, which means we'll be able to get it and modify it there. We could also have the body and camera on the variables or the info. However, I believe the info is meant for dynamic things, such as run speed and walk speed can be dynamically changed. So can the key codes, the state, the ground layers, all of those are generally dynamic and not connected with anything inside the game world. So I'll want a main camera. We'll do public head control game object main camera. We'll do, well, we also want the we could probably just get rid of this and do player controller, because let's see, controller. We could probably feed in a camera to the player controller, either on a start method, such as I'll talk about it a bit later. Let's see. Let's go over here, say public void start character. And here we'll do a game object for main camera. This will be used to connect the player, because we'll have the body, we'll have the updatables, and the head controller will be more or less connected. Let's see. Private. No, it'll be a public get game object main camera get private set. Then in the start, we'll do main camera equals main camera. And typically this is where you'll be starting the character from. You'll probably also have variables attached to the game handler or game manager. rather than in here. We could slip in saying, yes, we want a serialized field of a, actually, the general rule of thumb is this the way we're saving it, or the way that I'll be saving it, is using a JSON file, which anything inside this, the players will be able to see. Meaning, if I want them to willingly break the game, they can willingly break the game. Or I could simply remove the serialized field, because anything that you can't see in the inspector, you're not going to be able to see in the JSON file. Unless, of course, you do the hide in inspector attribute, which would go along inside this saying hide in inspector. Which means eventually we'll have this be more of a static that all game objects follow, such as if you drop an item, will refer to all the ground layers, whereas for the players, they'll still refer to this one. So this would be more of a world variable than a player variable. But we stuck it here for now because that's later on. So we'd put into the player controller the state of which is the player in a menu, is the player paused, is the player ready. Usually I like to go with is the player ready and is the player paused. Because if they're paused, then that means they are for sure ready. But if they're not ready, then they cannot pause and they cannot for sure move. You could say that is player ready could be a global variable, such as the layer mask. For instance, if you want zombies to move, they would only move if the player is ready. If this is multiplayer, then this would be more of is the player ready or is the player in a menu? And if they're in a menu, then their ready state won't necessarily matter. The ready state for the player would more or less indicate to the server saying, okay, don't show the player yet, possibly. I'm not too familiar with server sides, but generally for single player, having the state of the player readiness be available to all is a pretty good thing to have. So I'm going to do all of this. I will transfer over to a game manager later. Actually, I might do it now. Well, I'll get the head ready and then we'll do the game manager later on. So public bool player ready. Let's see. Start character. Player ready equals true. Now the good thing about having this be public is that everything, the handlers inside here, will automatically detect it if we have the main controller. For instance, getting the inputs. We only want to get the inputs if main controller.player ready is true. Which means if they are not ready, they will never be able to walk. For now, at least. The input general, datables, input handler. You could just essentially go over here and say input handling. Well, no, this is the wrong one. If player or main controller dot player ready is true. Again, this is more for a single player game. This would be more of a global variable. It cannot change globally, such as a zombie. You couldn't say, oh yes, the player is now here. It would be more of a only the player can really modify it or has the ability to modify such a variable. So with the head or the main camera now attached, the body is gotten, controller, input handler, updatable. We can go into this and say main camera is equal to main controller dot main camera. Yes. We can also go into here and say private main or player controller main controller. We can go in here and say main controller, or not main camera, controller equals main controller. And this, depending on what you want to do, such as we're going to have leaning, which means we'll want a state. Or for now, we're just going to do a rotating the head, or rotation of vertical and rotation of horizontal. So we're going to do public void rotate vertical. We're going to do a float and a mount. Now, prior to, or in the beginning, I used to use, what are they called? Euler or Euler angles. And that was limited severely. Usually they wouldn't necessarily, or rather there's a thing called a boiler lock, where once you rotate on an angle 90 degrees, the other two angles start rotating the exact same way. When you use rotation, the rotation will be much less severe. Actually, we can probably just do this. I'm not quite sure of the how much lag is created if you separate or if you just get the body and the head from within here and you keep doing the main controller dot body or dot main camera. I'm not entirely sure about that. You could look it up later on, or you could do some stress testing. Maybe for mobile it might be better to just have everything inside, but you would also be trading off having or organization per se. So let's do main controller dot. The main camera is the one that's going to be rotating upwards and downwards. The body will be the one that turns horizontally. Dot transform dot rotate. And you would be rotating around, let's see. So you would have main. So think about the rotation sort of like you have a wheel and then you have an axis sticking out from the wheel. Wherever that axis is where the wheel is going to rotate on. So let's say from the player, the axis is going out to the right. So they're facing forward and they have the really long stick out of their head going to the right. Their head will now rotate on that stick upwards and downwards. If you want to do, let's say, the horizontal, you would then need to skewer the player through the top of the head for them to then rotate. Meaning the vector 3 will be going upwards, whereas this one will be to the right of the player. Dot body dot transform dot right. If you were to do it on the left, then they would be going inverse to whatever is right. You can do a mount here and times by time dot delta time. This is to smooth it a bit. And the space relative to it will be self-contained, I believe. I'm not. If it's self-contained, that means when you do world rotation, such as leaning, or no, I'll have to give an update when, or we'll have to see, because I'm not entirely sure about this one. I barely pieced it together it works fairly well. It's just wonky to tell. Times time dot delta time space dot world. Generally, the body itself doesn't necessarily have a parent to it, so world and self are essentially the same. Now, we're not going to have either of these in the update. Instead, this will be in what I like to say as a mouse controller, because the mouse generally has different inputs than this. However, it still has relatively, well, the axis, like going left and right, up and down. You can click all the buttons you want. However, you have to use the button or the get access function. So let's do a mouse controller. Again, for this one, you can most likely have separate it into separate scripts. So that way, let's say you're aiming down a gun. When you right click, it'll change state. And as long as that button's being held down, the mouse controller is modified slightly. So generally, you could set it up just like how we have the input handler. I'm not necessarily going to be doing that for this one. If you want, I can do it later on when everything else is set up. But I would need to be told prior to when this is done. So let's do a mouse controller. Alright, stick this into here. This will be part of the eye updatable. I cannot for the life of me spell anything. Interface, go over here. So with this, in the player controller, we'll want to put in the public head controller. Likewise with the input controller or input general, or no, where is it? Input handler. You could probably have several head controllers inside. And you could reference the main head controller that's being used right then and there. And then you can come over here to the mouse controller and say, okay, first I want a private player controller. And then we'll do a public mouse controller, player controller, main controller. Go over here, main controller equals main controller. We can separate this into two things, saying, okay, nope, not public, private, void, move horizontal, and we'd say if with controllers and with mouses, generally there's a thing called a dead zone, which is how much the mouse needs to move or the, let's say, joystick needs to move before it actually starts doing something. Because for at least a controller like an Xbox 360 controller, the joysticks are not perfect. They're always going to have slight increments in their axis, meaning they're not always going to be 0, which will indefinitely register on the controller. So what we're going to do is we're going to do math f dot absolute value of, because a joystick can be negative or positive, but we want to do input.get axis, and I believe it's mouse horizontal. Yes. Is greater than, let's say, 0.5 f, or float. Then from here we'll do main controller dot head controller dot rotate horizontal, and actually we could probably, well, no, we could most likely put this into a float beforehand. Let's say private float horizontal. Leave it to me to spell one thing 3 different ways. And vertical. What you can do with these as well is you can restrict how far up someone can look up and how far down someone can look. So we'll say move horizontal, or yeah, we'll probably have to do it afterwards. Horizontal plus equals to the input dot get axis of the mouse horizontal. No. Well, this still is true. You're going to be doing this anyways. You may as well just come down here and say float amount equals input dot get axis mouse. So then you can just come here and say, okay, yes, I'll take this to put it into there. You can also say, oh, well, I don't want the horizontal to go up, let's say, above 80. Plus amount is greater than, let's say, 80. Or, yeah, less than 80. You can say, okay, now if it's this much, I can put into here. And generally you're not going to be controlling how far up someone looks and how far down someone looks. So there's that. The updatable again is for leaning. So we can do private void move. I'm going to stop right here and I'll come back when I have the vertical set up as well. Alright, so I was slightly wrong with the naming. It's mouse X for going left to right on the mouse, and mouse Y which goes up and down. Now for some unknown reason, I believe it's the mouse or the input, but this one, the mouse Y, is naturally inversed, which to me makes no sense. You can also come in here and say, okay, well, I want my public, or yeah, this one shall be public. Void snap to neck. And we'll do main controller dot main camera dot transform dot position equals, and from here you can say, okay, well, I want a public or private vector 3 of where the head will be. So for standing, it will be vector 3 dot up. Oh yes, you should make this a local position. If you're making it a regular position, you're more likely than not just gonna have your head fly off into the distance and be somewhere where you don't really want it to be. Unless not on the neck is where you want it to be, in which case it's perfectly there. So then when we come over here to the player controller, we can come into the camera and say, okay, well, I don't want it to be true just yet, but we'll do a head controller dot snap to neck, and let's come back into here. Oh yes, we forgot. So a game manager is typically the only one that's going to be setting this up. What we can do, start, add input handlers, start character, and for now we're just going to do a serialized field private game object camera. Or we don't even need to do that. We can just do a quick shortcut, and I don't recommend doing this all the time. It's better to have the main camera always known to all the objects. But we can do game object dot find or dot main camera dot game object. So this gets the main active camera. And now if we snap to here, or if we press play, if it doesn't work, then I'll probably come back. Oh, bugger. Alright, so the reason it wasn't working is because the main camera wasn't, at least in my scene, wasn't tagged main camera. However, I still went into here and I simply just set up the main camera right here. So we can just drag it into here and say, okay, well, snapping on. Oh, gosh. Alright, it seems like I had a couple things off. I forgot the mouse controller, the head controller. I needed to add the mouse controller to the updatables. And add it up here, right underneath the private input handler. For the most part, it works perfectly fine. And by perfectly fine, I mean barely. Now, what is a tiny bit unfortunate is I'm not sure why this one isn't working. I'm pretty sure this one is working. However, this can be tweaked a little bit later. For instance, you would probably just have this replace this because, whoops, yeah. The only one that you'd probably not have, well, you would have the vertical because you'd want to look up into the sky and then down at your own ass. So, if I play this right now, you can see that it works. Somewhat. Wait. Please be smarter than I am. Alright, yeah, it works. Now you'll probably just have a mouse sensitivity in the variables, which then you multiply that by the head controller, which will be internal logic for the mouse controllers. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope this taught you something, and I hope to see you all next time. Have a fantastic day.